Stuart Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is a pleasure to speak on the Social Security Clothing Allowances for Orphans and Unsupported Children Amendment Bill. And often I think members read out the name of the bill, the longer the better, to take up a bit of time, but I'm not doing that tonight, Mr Speaker. It is a pleasure, and I'd like to pay due homage to Tracy Martin for bringing this bill forward. And I think I note in the speech that she led off the third reading with that she paid a lot of credit and said it's not my bill, it's Di Vivian's bill. And I take on board what she was saying, and I know the point that she was trying to make. But one of the responsibilities that comes with being a Member of Parliament is passing legislation, and this is the only way that it can be done. And so I know what you're saying, but actually it is your bill. It is your name that's going to be on it, Tracy, and it's quite an achievement to get it this far. And, you know, as it's been alluded to, you had to do a deal, but that's politics, and politics is the art of the possible. So well done for doing that. I also think there's quite a bit of irony tonight. It was only last week in the budget debate we were given a hard time for not speaking for long enough. Now we're being given a hard time for speaking for too long. So I think it's a bit of an odd thing, but that's politics. And I guess being in opposition is about opposing, so that's fair enough, I guess. Mr Speaker, I didn't have I wasn't on the select committee that considered this bill, because obviously it was done prior to the election, but it seems like a pretty good result that's come through from this bill, and I think it's, as has been spoken, Jenny, the previous speaker, Jenny Salisa, that's a pretty tough sort of a thing to have to deal with, and I know that those families in that situation have got enough to deal with without having to worry about money. But this is what this bill seeks to address. Under Section 363 of the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act of 1989, the Chief Executive is responsible for the administration and has the discretion to determine rates of payment for foster children. And that at present that discretion has been used to determine a rate for clothing allowances. But that is only for which orphans and unsupported children are not eligible. So this bill seeks to redress that. This bill seeks to insert a new section, 29B, into the Social Security Act of 1964 to establish a clothing allowance for children whose caregivers receive an orphan's benefit or an unsupported child's benefit, and that will allow this mechanism to work. In the interim, the government, as part of the Children's Action Plan, Mr Speaker, has committed an extra $10 million to provide further support for kin carers. And a ministerial reference group was set up to organise the funding and how that might be applied. An unsupported child's benefit is available only when a family breaks down, as was mentioned in other cases, but an orphan's benefit applies when the children's parents have either died or cannot be found. And that's a very traumatic, either one of those situations is very traumatic for the family as a whole, certainly for the children. And when kin carers step in to deal with this, they've got enough to deal with without having to go with the knowledge that they're not actually getting the same amount of money that they would do were they looking after a child that wasn't related to them. So, as I said, this bill seeks to address that. I think one of the major things we need to realise that under the current rules that have been set up, there's no income test or asset test for the people receiving these benefits, and they can receive another benefit at the same time, which obviously makes sense. They're going to have extra costs. The child who automatically qualifies for a community services card, which is a great financial benefit for them. And we've got to recognise, I think one of my colleagues said earlier, that there's more than 12,000 children in New Zealand who are being looked after by kin carers. That's a heck of a lot of children when you think about it. And it must be pretty traumatic for those families, but it's not that long ago or that many generations ago that families were involved as a matter of course in the wider family, bringing up children. And I know certainly in my electorate, in the Pacific Island community in particular, I know that this is quite common today. It's not generally in the Pākehā community, but only going back a few generations ago, that was the case. And I think we've lost something today when we no longer have that close connection with grandparents in that way, because there's so much you can learn from previous generations. Lots of things were passed down through the families, and in fact, as the way with Māori and Pacifica, that was how their whakapapa was passed down. And I think that's an interesting thing that, and I hope it keeps up as it is going through a renaissance at the moment. Mr. Speaker, those grandparents that are now bringing it up, of course, today, the gap between the age of a grandparent and a grandchild is much greater than it was those generations ago when families were involved, because couples are now choosing to have their families later in life than they were before, whereas they would quite often be in their early 20s. They're now in their mid-30s often and late 30s, and so that gap for the grandparents is much greater. In addition to that, of course, technology has come into play today, and there's a whole lot of things moved on. And while I'm sure most people and members in the House are involved with social media in one form or other, and certainly as I am, and I see my colleagues are busy indulging in it often at the moment, but I have teenage children, Mr. Speaker, and they are light years ahead of me in the way they utilise social media. Yes, but it's true. It's true.
Can the member at least attempt to relate that to the bill?
I am, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, there is a refresher course offered to grandparents and kin carers, returning to the front line of parenting, and that is absolutely a part of that. And it's a very important part, I believe. So more than 300 children have benefited from the first round of extraordinary care fund that was put up, and this is going back to the Select Committee decision, which I'll come to in a moment. And the grants are available for up to $2,000 per child. That covers extra tutoring for kids struggling at school, for orthodontic work not funded by the Ministry of Health, the costs of attending national and regional sports tournaments, and for music lessons where a child is progressing ahead of their peers. And I think when a child is in a situation where it's being brought up by their grandparent or kin carer, and they're in a situation where they have a talent or they need some extra help with their tutoring or with their teeth, with their orthodontic work, it's only right that they should have the funding to cover that, and I think that's fantastic. There's been a lot of talk about the 2018 implementation date, but I note that the Select Committee decided that the existing measures that are in place that I've just spoken about, along with changes proposed to the bill, which have been accepted, would sufficiently address the issue of parity. The school and school year start-up payment is a new policy initiative, and its funding is expected to fall back within baseline levels by 2018.
Order. For the last minute, I'm going to challenge the member not just to read out the report. Thank you.
I'm not reading out
word for word.
Oh, okay. All right, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, the Select Committee made a decision to put the implementation date out to 2018. And I think that has been, if we don't do that, you're going to fix one inequity by creating another. And I think, Mr. Speaker, it makes perfect sense to delay the start until 2018. They won't be any worse off, although it will be under a different payment format. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, it's with great pleasure that I commend the bill to the House. Thank you.
Poto Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.